Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Carrel. I've got an introductory slide up here, so we'll do a little bit of things. This is really talking about a journey. Now, I'm supposed to present this with Kevin Brown, but he couldn't make it, so he gave me permission to lie about it. I mean, to tell his story. And so this is about when we start out on a reliability journey, and we get a little bit into it. How do we make sure that we're doing the right things? And so this is about setting up a 2-year journey, being a year into the 2-year journey, and looking back and measuring how did we do and what's next and what else is available. So we're going to talk about this. This is the University of Kansas Health System owns a hospital in Olathe, Kansas. And this is the journey that the Olathe Hospital did. Now, it was interesting. The journey started with Olathe Medical Center being its own entity. And about 6 months into the 2-year journey, the University of Kansas acquired the Olathe Medical Center. So a lot of the rules changed, and you have to be flexible and things like that. And I'll talk a little bit about what that meant to them in being able to continue with what they were doing, even though the players in the administration had changed. So let's do this. There we go. So Kevin Brown, the Assistant Director of Facilities, not here. Said to say sorry, but he couldn't make it because he's in healthcare, and sometimes that's what happens. So, and then the other one is me. I'm a certified reliability leader. How many CRLs are in the room? Thank you very much for doing that. If you're not a CRL, please raise your hand. Okay, do you feel embarrassed? If you're not a CRL, you should be. And this is a great place this week to learn about what that means and how to get that to happen and what are the benefits of doing that. I earned my CRL in long time ago. And 3 or 4 years ago, I finished a series of 5 peer-reviewed projects that relate to the Uptime element successfully. And because of that, I was awarded a black belt. There are 20 of us in the world. And I believe this week, either 5 or 6 other people will be awarded their black belts publicly from the main stage here. So that's pretty good. I would encourage, if you have an inkling to be part of any type of a reliability program, it is the shortest distance between 2 points, that whole CRL. Do you agree? Good. I didn't pay him to say that or anything. So we're going to talk about how the plan was developed. We'll go through what that plan was, and then the progress to that plan, some things that we learned along the way, and sometimes how we had to pivot, and then what the future expectations are. Is there anything that you would want to know that's not up there? Okay, good. I usually get that same answer. So it's really all about this, and this is the framework here. And I will tell you, even though we're talking about a healthcare environment, healthcare is, and of course, healthcare, oil and gas, food production, higher ed, utilities, they're all unique, every one of them. And most of them are incredibly unique in the way in which they're all the same. Because they still have pumps and fans, and they still have digital systems, and they still have procurement people to deal with. And so in healthcare, part of the uniqueness in healthcare is that there are rules that are written by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. It's interesting, it's Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, but it's not CMMS. That's a different thing. So it's CMS, and they say if you want to be a hospital, if you want to be a licensed facility, you have to do it our way. In fact, the vast majority, and I'm talking about 90% of the funding for a hospital comes from reimbursements from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Medicare reimbursements, 90% of the funding. If you don't do it right, they reduce your reimbursement rate. So now we're talking about real money. Now we're concerned. It's real money. We're also concerned about people's lives. right? So if I've got a fan that's supplying a toilet exhaust, nobody cares unless it's right after lunch. If I've got a fan that's supplying a suite of operating rooms, everybody cares, especially the guy on the table. And so the risk for some of these pieces of equipment is literally life and death. And because of that, there are these very strict rules about what can and cannot happen. Over the years, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have changed much of what they've asked or demanded that healthcare facilities do. And so you have to stay up on the changes. In January of 2024, CMS changed the requirements from having absolute non-negotiable 100% compliance with original equipment manufacturer guidelines for preventive maintenance. That's what hospitals were up against. You have to be able to document and prove at the drop of a hat on an unannounced survey that you are 100% compliant with original equipment manufacturer guidelines. Anybody in here do that? Of course we don't. We're smarter than that. But in healthcare, they had to until January of 2024. And if you count back, that wasn't all that long ago, was it? We're not even a year into this. And the Joint Commission said, okay, if you want to follow a reliability-centered maintenance approach, if you want to do something different, you can for everything in which you do less than what the OEM says or less often than when they say to do it. So you have an air handler that has pre-filters, after filters, HEPA filters. It's got UV lights because the air that comes out of that goes into very critical spaces. The manufacturer says, change filters monthly. We're talking some real cost here. And some highly expensive filters in which you're replacing absolutely clean filters with absolutely clean filters. And you have to do it until January of 2024, when you could say we're going to change the filters based on the differential pressure across the filter bank. So we're only replacing dirty filters with clean filters. We're going to do it way less often, and we're going to be able to repurpose a big chunk of our budget into some of our deferred maintenance. That's the difference that was made in 2024. And that was the nexus of this project beginning with the Olathe Medical Center, was the opportunity and the privilege to be able to redo what they had been doing for many years and make it more sensible, which is really what that was about. This is what is sensible. You can paint a line from each one of these 36 elements to the requirements that the Joint Commission for Hospital Accreditation gets from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That compliance can be mapped to all of these elements. I'm not going to go through that today. That would take a couple of weeks worth of training, and I'd be happy to talk that long, but you wouldn't be. So. We started with saying, okay, if you wanted to do and paint a picture of your best life in this organization, what does that look like? What are the pictures of the ideal future as it relates to maintenance and reliability and asset management? These are the 4 things that they said. This is what they said. Their goal was 0 unplanned downtime. This Wednesday at 2 o'clock at some room, not sure which one it is, I get to be part of a presentation with an individual by the name of Dan Coxall, who in fact is here. And Dan is the Executive Vice President for Support Services for the Children's Hospital Colorado. They have 4 hospitals. He has something which I call the Dan rule, because his name is Dan and he made the rule. The Dan rule is, and this is a children's hospital, there's a lot of risk in children's hospitals. He says, no patient, no parent, no practitioner, no staff member, no visitor, no technician should ever have to have an opportunity in which they have to write a work order to effect some change because it will have a negative effect on the patient experience. That is swinging for the fences. That's what reliability is all about. Because if all we're talking about is getting a little better, that, let's raise the bar. How about zero unplanned downtime? None. That's our goal. Zero. None. Now, it's not zero downtime, because sometimes you have to schedule that. And it's not zero failures, because the outcome of a lot of the reliability-centered maintenance analyses are you have some pieces of equipment that are designed to run to fail, so failure there is planned. You just don't know when it's going to happen. Zero unplanned downtime. High employment satisfaction and engagement. Who has that now? What a great goal for a reliability program. Highly trained and technically competent. Have you noticed the bench is a little light these days? There's just not the same kind of, we don't do vocational technical schools in public education very often anymore. There's not a lot of people going into that. There's almost a stigma that says that if you're not in the trades, you're a second-class citizen. You need to go get a completely worthless college degree and go into debt for it. In the meanwhile, the bench is empty. They said, let's have a highly trained and technically competent organization. Anybody have that? Yeah, we're getting there, right? Great goal for a reliability program. And they wanted to be able to have departmental specific performance metrics. They didn't have any. If we're trying to get stuff done and we don't have any metrics to measure where we're going, then we might as well close our eyes and run as fast as we can into a forest and hope that we don't face plant on the side of a bur oak. But with metrics, we have a path to follow and we have something to measure how we're doing. And they didn't have any, and they said, let's build some that are meaningful. So the current state, the not so much, that we don't want this so much, this is what they were currently involved in. Their current training absolutely missed the mark. Now, they did have training programs, they just didn't actually advance people's knowledge, but it was training, and they could check the box that they had training. They spent a great deal of time in non-maintenance activities. That's not going to change. You can break down maintenance into categories. You've got planned maintenance, things you want to do, planned. Another word for planned would be expected. You've got unplanned maintenance, and another word for unplanned would be unexpected. And then you've got this other stuff that maintenance does because they're the people with the tools. So you work in a central plant, but somebody wants you to go hang a TV on the wall. Okay, got to do that. It's not maintenance, but somebody's got to do it. So they said, let's account for that portion because that has a great deal to do with resource allocation. It's not going to go away. We work in a hospital. There are doctors that work in hospitals, and some of them are demanding. And you have to account for that because that's what generates the revenue. So you have to account for that non-maintenance activity. And they weren't, and they had a lot of it. But they didn't know how much they had. They just knew they had a lot of it. And they were forced to be highly reactive, mainly because they had all this other stuff that they had to do. And there was very little accountability and ownership. And in the beginning of the discussions, they talked a lot about the technicians not being accountable. And at the end of the discussion, what they realized is that what they needed more than anything else was a mirror. Because if you want people to be accountable, you show them the way. You be accountable first. There is an uptime element about that. It's called integrity. Well, they said, okay, if we know that this is where we want to be, all the good stuff, and we're over here, and we should be here, but we're here, why aren't we here? Now, if anybody have any kind of lean manufacturing background? You know what they call this? Value stream mapping. It's identifying waste in the manufacturing stream. And they said, we're going to call waste in maintenance and reliability those things we should be doing that we're not, or things that we're not doing that we should. And those become the gaps. So they have no plan. All right, they're set up to fail from the beginning. They have no plan. So can you be successful? Well, that would be kind of an opinion if you don't have a plan. You go, I'm doing great. How do you know? I just said I was. I have no plan, which means I'm not measuring anything. There's too many open positions on their staff. Did we say something about a bench? Anybody here fully staffed? Why not? They knew at the time that we were going into this that this acquisition by the University of Kansas health system was going to take place, but they didn't know what was going to happen, and they didn't know when, and they didn't know the effect, and that had effect on the culture on the shop floor. And then finally, they just decided, and this is their opinion, that the place they worked was an unattractive place to work. Now, I don't think it was. I've been in a lot of places, and I didn't think it was, but they did. What do you think that had an effect on their hiring capabilities? Or when you bring somebody in that's new, and his only source of what it's like there are the curmudgeons that believe this, and that's what you're up against. I've seen that. Maybe you haven't, but I've seen that happen. So they said, okay, we need to get stakeholders, and we have to identify who those are, and subject matter experts, we need to get those engaged in this process, because they're the ones that are going to be pulling it through the water. And so that doesn't necessarily mean the person with the right business card or the right title. These are the functional and cultural leaders within the organization. Take some time to identify those and get them engaged up front. Commit to the whole thing. We're not just going to do a little bit and say, that's great, wipe our hands, put a binder on the shelf, and walk away. We're going to go all the way to the end. We're going to take it to the horizon. We're going to finish, and we're going to judge ourselves on how well we're finishing. And then they decided that after we talked to them a little bit about this, that's what they're going to do. They're going to use the Uptime Elements as their framework. How many people do that? We need more hands. How many people use the Uptime Elements as a framework? Okay, that's much better. I probably just didn't ask it right the first time. So there'll be a lot of raising of hands and stuff. I just got to, keep you up in the meeting. So how are they going to be success? These are the metrics they put in place. Now, this is an organization that is a facility management organization, and they are the FM body for hospitals. That's what they do. So part of it was, we want to be so good that they renew our contract and with a greater scope of work and increased profitability. That's not a bad thing to ask, is it? They wanted those elements of the future state that they put together, all of those to be realized. They wanted the human capital, the people there, that there be genuine, measurable growth and achievement on the part of everybody who was on the team. And that their new identity, instead of being a horrible place to work, was this over here. That when you think about that organization, you can't help but to think about the Uptime Elements. Now that's a culture shift. And we tried doing it in the next week, it didn't work. We had to put something together that lasted longer because, we said, okay, be that way, and that didn't work. So it took a bit of activity, and one of the things that we did is said, if we're gonna base it on this, let's figure out where we are today. Let's take a look at this. What are we doing well? What are we doing horribly? What are we doing kind of okay? And then that'll help us prioritize what we need to do. Now, you have the Uptime Elements GPS, which Reliability Web has, and Asset Analytics does some things, and it's a great tool. And if you haven't used this, I would recommend it. It's a great tool to find out where you are today. It's a snapshot of what's happening. We, because this happened before that was out there, we did it manually, and this is how we did it. We said, okay, we're going to do some work. We got a bunch of stakeholders in the room, and we said, what are we either not doing or doing horribly? That's red. What are we doing and we're adequately, we're kind of on the journey. We've made decent progress. We're not there, but it's kind of underway. And then finally, what is already underway? What are we hitting? What are we achieving? Okay? So just activity alone doesn't give you a green. It has to be successful activity. So remember, red, we're horrible. Yellow, we're on a journey. Green, we're doing well. Do you remember that? This is how they graded themselves. So they said the reliability strategy development, anybody who's a CRL, tell me the 3 parts of reliability strategy development. Right. Failure modes and effects analysis. In the passport, it calls it a preventive maintenance optimization. That's a part of it. There's a planned maintenance optimization, which is part of it. I prefer the P to stand for precision. So there's a failure modes and effects analysis. There's the precision maintenance optimization, and much of that is accomplished by going through a classical RCM analysis. So, but they said, oh, we haven't done that. We haven't even started that. No reliability center design. In fact, the plant operations team were never even invited to the table when they start talking about new construction projects. That's how you get air handlers that have a pipe right by the door to the filters, so you can't open the door to the filters. And I know nobody in the room's ever seen that. Or the air handler that hangs from the ceiling on a platform, and it has this all-thread rod hanging from a thing on the ceiling right in front of the door, and you can't get to the, can't clean the coils, but it sure looks good. And it's shiny for a while. No asset condition information, no vibration, so they weren't doing really well. They did have an infrared camera that I think they would play with it, but at least they had one. And they bought a SDT an SDT 370, I think, or 270, which is the little ultrasound device. They had that. It was still in the plastic. They'd had it for a year. Nobody had actually gone through the online course or anything, but they did have it. So we call that a yellow. Their CMMS they were going to have to change to another one, which they're in the midst of doing. They had a PM program they didn't like. And in healthcare, the operators are the maintainers. So, but it wasn't like the group was being highly reliable, and some of it was because they weren't taught to be. So you can see how this goes. I broke it down into different categories here. So the red, these are the elements that are in the red. Okay, and this, what I could say is, instead of saying you're horrible at this, I say these are the places where the greatest opportunity lies. Reliability strategy development, and I am a reliability geek. I love that element. I love just crunching data and looking at stuff and going, I think it's fabulous, and but that's me. Reliability centered design, where they at least ought to be able to have a say in what's going in there. Then the condition management activities, planning and scheduling, MRO, spares management, defect elimination. How do you run a maintenance organization with no planning and scheduling? The phone rings, you run. Whatever they say, you go do. That's how you do it. It is 100% reactive. And then, of course, the strategy and plan, which is that one-page document that the executive team signs off. your strategic asset management plan, which is the several binders of how we're going to do this. And then they had no performance indicators, so they didn't know if they were doing good or bad anyway. In the yellow, which is stuff that they had started and kind of were making activity, are here. And you'll notice they had started a learning program. It wasn't effective. So, but we couldn't say red because they actually did have one. And then the reliability engineering, and that's the fun part of that one, is the taking like a 3-year work order history and going through the 3-year work order history, breaking it down between planned, unplanned, and other, and then looking at the unplanned and what are the root causes and how do we get to what are the failure modes that we're looking at and the causes of those failure modes, and then developing the Pareto analyses for that. And it's just, I mean, it's almost like a feast. It's wonderful stuff because that tells you where the need is. There's a book in the bookstore called Left to Right, Right to Left. It's a book on defect elimination. And if you don't have that, I would get it. It's a great read. And it talks about the difference between, in defect elimination, between those major activities, because RCM analysis is a defect elimination for major effects. Then you get to the other side of the Pareto where you got the little bitty parts, and that's where a lot of the right to left work happens. And there's a completely different type of activity for that. I'd recommend that book if you haven't got it already. And then the stuff that they were kind of doing at the end of year one, after going through this is where they are today, because this month is the end of year one. And so the reliability strategy development, they've gone through the reliability-centered maintenance analysis with a vast majority of their equipment. They have a brand new precision maintenance optimization that they're implementing. They're upgrading their CMMS right now. They had things like, remember, the Joint Commission says you have to prove you're doing maintenance on these air handlers, and you have to prove you're doing either what the OEM says or you've got an alternative equipment maintenance plan in place, but you have to prove it. They had a work order for 27 air handlers, one work order for 27 air handlers that said, perform annual maintenance. Anybody think there's an upgrade needed right there?
They met the requirement.
No, because literally and they got dinged on this, they point to air handler 8. I just made up the number. Air handler 8, and they said, show us the PM for air handler 8. And they couldn't do it. And the reason they couldn't do it is because air handler 8 is a fan wall and air handler 5 is belt driven. And one has UV lights and one doesn't. And one is heated by heating hot water and one is heated by steam. And one has direct expansion cooling and one is chilled water. And they couldn't prove it. In fact, 3 of their air handlers weren't even in their CMMS. Tough to prove you're doing those, you know. So they did that. We went through they're now at the table. So maintenance now has, one of the directors sits at the planning table with their planning, design, and construction team and has an input, an equal input into design. That's huge. They're still working on the condition management activities because they don't have a footprint large enough to have their own vibration analyst. They need to outsource that, so you got to go find one and see, and go through a procurement process. They now have a planner scheduler. And that's planner scheduler. She's kind of like Radar O'Reilly. Anybody remember MASH? What did Radar O'Reilly know? Everything. Ran the place. The centerpiece of all the activity in that MASH 4077 was Radar O'Reilly. That's their planner scheduler. They're working on developing an MRO sphere. Right now they're going through the data to learn what their stocking levels and reorder points are for what pieces, what stuff they have on the shelf they don't need, but it was part of the original equipment manufacturer's recommended spare parts list, which is a really long term for increased margin improvement. because you don't need it. If you got stuff on your shelf they've retired pieces of equipment that still has the spare parts on the shelf. Strategies and plans they wrote a wonderful document that the executive signed off. It's posted at specific places in the hospital that talks about the organization's commitment to reliability and asset management, building the strategic asset management plan, because that's a lot bigger task. And then they have their performance indicators. At the end of year one, the stuff by the way, that was all stuff that started in red. Here's the stuff that started in yellow. The learning program is still being developed, but the rest of them, they're there. They've got it. Now they're bringing in a new computerized maintenance management system, but one of the requirements that they built is that all this stuff that we did to build this new program has to be migrated over, and if you can't do that, you're not qualified to be our provider. They put together a list of non-negotiable requirements for a CMMS. And that means that if I'm a CMMS provider and I can do 90% of those things, I am not qualified. Because non-negotiable means non-negotiable. And you know who built that list? They did. So it's not like somebody's got to convince them that this is something that they need. Things like it has to be on a handheld. We're not doing paper anymore. That's non-negotiable. Single sign-on, non-negotiable. So a whole list of things. Also things in how the planner scheduler uses it, how the work orders are done. So instead of what was done is just text. You ever seen a work order like that? It's like, here's the thing that's wrong, and maybe you can read it. And then, what you did about it, so it's broke, fixed. You can't do that anymore.
Integrate a loop routing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so that's what they're using their ultrasound first is to do that. Then they built a lubrication area to store all their lubricants. They even, in some of the smaller motors, they went to sealed bearings. Yeah. And instead of doing monthly lubrications, it's like every 6 to 9 months they have to add lubricant because they were way over lubricating. Yeah. So the CMMS is going and the learning program is still underway. Here's some things that they learned. They said, first of all, keep the momentum going. And it's like you're pulling a battleship, but you're using dental floss. So once you got momentum going, keep it going. Don't pull too hard because you'll break the dental floss. But you keep that momentum going. And if you do, you'll get to where you need to be. If you stop, you have to regain momentum. You have to start again with the momentum, and that's painful. Then they said, be prepared to pivot. Plenty of times with that, because every plan is great. But there are times when instead of doing what it is that you'd planned to do, something changed. A person retires. Somebody finds a new job. There's a change in a specification on a new piece of equipment. The Joint Commission changes their rules. Things change, so you have to be able to kind of plant your left foot and pivot and be okay with that. Be flexible. Then, keeping everybody informed and aware. So in a hospital, guess who everybody is? Yeah, now the patients, not so much. I mean, they don't care. You're going to give them a report in the morning, and this is the work orders that we did. They don't care. But the administration does, and the CFO does, and the nursing staff does, and the doctors do, and the lab technicians, and the people in procurement. Keep them all informed and aware at all times. Keep them up to date. This was new because maintenance people don't want to talk. They want to be with their cart in a mechanical room with the door closed and locked doing their work. They don't want to be in front of people. They don't want to do that. So this was something new to learn, how to talk well about yourself. And if you can get the maintenance people to talk well about what's going on, their view of the organization naturally begins to change. And it's no longer a horrible place to work because they're the ones that are making it great. Then finally, don't be afraid of the necessary changes that the data shows. Data doesn't have an opinion. It doesn't have an objective that it tries to fill in the justification for it. That's politicians. Data's data, and sometimes it's not pretty, but it is correct. Data's never manipulated, because as soon as it's manipulated, it's not data, it's opinion. And data is always greater than opinion. And so when the data says, you need to improve this, be okay with that, put a plan together and improve it, because once you do, the data doesn't apply anymore, because now it's good again. So you have to not be afraid to make the changes that the data will uncover. Don't cut corners. I love the classical RCM analysis and the detail that's involved in that. If you cut a corner, you cut quality. And I know that there are people that say that, you can do this, you can have it a little, sorry, I'm not buying it. And I've been doing this for almost 50 years. You cut detail, you cut quality. Now you can replicate some things that are replicatable, and that's okay too. If I've got 6 identical air handlers, I don't need to do, and everything is the same about them, the area that they serve, their risk, all of that is the same. I don't need to do 6 different RCM analyses. I can do one and apply it to those 6. But as soon as I change a metric, I have to change the analysis. And we need to be disciplined to do that. And admit when you're wrong. There's an element about that. And it's going to happen. So you don't take it personal, because we're all in a learning process together and we're growing and developing. And, usually it's this is the way we've always done it, I can't change. I love that phrase, because that's usually the place to start. Yeah. Do what you said you would do when you said you would do it. That's part of what you report out to the organization too. We said we would go from 85% of our work orders being demand work orders, critical, very reactive, and we want to bring that as close to 15% as we can. Here's the steps we're going to take. We want to go from 85 to 60 and from 60 to 55, and then you make these steps along the way, and when you get there, you report that you did. But you keep going. And if you want to get to 15, don't be happy with 45. And you report all the wins and all the challenges. So there's a problem that kept occurring where the maintenance guys kept getting a call because there's a refrigerator on one of the wards, and there's medicine and stuff like that kept in the refrigerator. And the refrigerator alarm would go off, and so the process was to call maintenance and have them go look at it. And they'd go look at it, and you know why the alarm was going off? Somebody left the door open. So they'd say, you left the door open, and they say, but the charge nurse says that we're not allowed to deal with an alarm on the refrigerator, we have to call maintenance. And I kind of get that because, there could be a mechanical problem in a thing, but they left the door open. So they went through a defect elimination process and brought in people from nursing and people from procurement and people from maintenance and all these different cross-functional part of a team, and they said, here, solve this. Here's was their solution. For the first 30 minutes, the charge nurse owns the alarm. It's their job to find out what to do about it. After 30 minutes, it goes to maintenance. The number of those calls went down to almost 1%. Because it gave, the door's open. I know I can just close the door. So it's not a compressor that's bad. It's not that you have a refrigerant leak. It's that somebody left the door open. And so that was both a challenge and a win. And then there was a metric that they could then report to. And everybody liked it. The nurses liked it. The maintenance guys really liked it. Because they're in the middle of something. Remember, in that closed door with the door locked in their cart right there, and now they got to put stuff away and walk into the hallway and go back down to the ward and do the, and close the door. Then walk back and restart again and finally close the door and lock it and be happy again. They didn't have to do that anymore. They could just stay in their room. Very happy people. So they haven't got to zero unplanned downtime. They have had about a 70% reduction though. The employee satisfaction and engagement is moving up. People who they were just doing whatever minimum, hiding out, they're now frontline, they're ready, they're eager, they're asking for stuff to do. They're training. It's not like they've added a whole bunch of people, but they're putting a formal training program in place that's very technically specific to the individual's position. And they appreciate that. They're getting vendors coming in and saying, this is how you do the maintenance on our piece of equipment. They never had that before. And their performance metrics that they put together, they're not only meeting those, but they're sharing them with other departments and letting them know. The reason you can't just stop a maintenance guy and say, hey, can you go fix this, is because you need a work order. And if I don't have a work order, I can't go do it unless it's an emergency, because it is a hospital. But if it's not an emergency, please put a work order in. And then we'll get it done in the right amount of time with the right materials, and we'll be able to get it done the right way the first time, instead of having to revisit it all the time because you just told me as I was walking down the hallway. Because what the heck, I got tools. Of course I could just stop and fix this, right? Yeah, do a work order. So they started sharing those performance metrics with other departments that helped the other departments. And now they feel that the service that they're getting from plant operations is much better. And it's an open discussion about how this place runs, instead of, I don't know what happens on the other side of the wall, except they make a lot of noise. They're moving forward. He wanted to put this slide in there. Moving forward, I think that there's a state motto somewhere where that's the state motto. But moving forward, that's Wisconsin, I think. So if you have any questions, there's my information. If you want to call Kevin and find out whether or not I lied about him, then you can just please reach out to him and do that. I appreciate the time. Does anybody have any questions about this? Anybody hate it? Okay, good. Well, I appreciate your time. Enjoy this time. Wednesday, 2 o'clock, look for the one that's got me and Dan Coxall on there. We're going to talk about the journey that Children's Hospital's on, Children's Hospital Colorado, and how they're sustaining that journey and the things he's put in place to do that. All right? Thank you very much.